My name is Tristan Wallace. I'm one of the organizers of the symposium. So far we have had 3 excellent panels, and we have one final panel remaining that will center around China. I would like to introduce the moderator of the panel, Professor Manuel Pino. Mr. Pino is a visiting professor at the School of International and Public Affairs. He's also taught at Yale University and taught in Beijing this summer. From 2005 to 2009, he served as the Minister of Economy and Innovation in Portugal. He's also the Director of International MBA at Lisbon Institute, Vice Chairman of BES Africa, Senior International Advisor at Rolenberger Strategy Consultants, and a member of the International Advisory Board of Gamesa. Ladies and gentlemen, Manuel Pino and the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to congratulate the organizers of the 2012 Columbia University Energy Symposium. You did a fantastic work. It was a pleasure to follow the development of this project with Tristan, Benjamin, now lately with Ruan. You deserve the best. Formerly, I was your professor. Now please consider myself as a friend. Congratulations. Thank you very much to our panelists for accepting to be here with us. We really want to learn from you. You have a lot of things to say about China. This panel is about how China's emergence is impacting global energy resources. I was in Beijing for 2 months during the last summer teaching at Renmin University and BFSU. And for me, it's difficult to find the right words to describe how I was impressed. I plan to go back next summer because there are many things I want to discover by myself. China's achievements are amazing, and the Chinese are very friendly. I became their friend. It is fair to say that the economic reform launched by Deng Xiaoping in 1978 was a watershed. As a result of market-oriented reforms, China will very likely become the largest economy of the world during this decade, although it will remain a relatively poor country in terms of income per capita. China's importance is huge. Since 2005, China has contributed directly with 1/3 to world GDP growth, much more than the US, Europe, and Japan combined. Indirectly, China is the #1 engine of growth for many resource exporters, such as Brazil, Australia, and many African countries. This has created an unprecedented pressure on natural resources all along, from energy to water and land. It is fair to say that we entered a resource revolution. We just had 2 days ago a lecture by the new executive director of the International Energy Agency, presenting the World Energy Outlook 2012, where he stated that, projected that energy consumption will grow by 50% in the next 25 years, and China and other fast-growing economies should account for 90% of this increase. So if we want to discuss energy and natural resources, it's really to China and to the other fast-growing economies that we should look. China, natural resources, and energy are a very exciting topic. We are eager to listen to you, and I would pass the floor first to Lucia, okay?
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Lucia Green-Weiskell. I am from the Innovation Center for Energy and Transportation. We're an NGO that's based in Beijing, and we work on transportation policy, but also more recently we've been working on climate change policy, efforts to measure greenhouse gas emissions across nations, working on developing standards to make sure that those measurements are apples-to-apples comparisons rather than something else. I am actually based in New York now, although I've spent quite a bit of time in Beijing. I wanted to start out just by saying something very broad, and actually I'm glad that you mentioned the International Energy Agency, their recent report about US energy, becoming energy self-dependent by 2035, or at least having that capacity to do so, becoming the largest exporter of oil, or largest producer of oil, rather, I think has significant impacts for China, and I think that's where I wanted to start very broadly. I had a few comments, and then, and I think maybe some of my panelists might want to address this as well. And then I wanted to say just a couple things about transportation, some of the work specifically that we've been doing. So broad statement, then some very specific, narrower things. I think that report really struck me because I think some of the media press that covered it made it seem as if that we're all supposed to relax now, that this is this great news. The United States is going to become able to produce the energy that it needs, and this is primarily because of the discovery of shale gas and also new oil extraction technology. My feeling is that that's a bit misleading, and we need to look at this with further scrutiny. I think the report itself actually really reveals a future that's marked by an uncertainty and actually declining supply. If you look at the numbers, one of the reasons why the United States projected output has gone up, relatively speaking, is because the projections for the other two larger exporters of oil, Saudi Arabia and Russia, have both gone down significantly in the projections to 2025. So really, we're looking at a world where there are significant shortages. And my worry is that if we look at this report and we say, oh, this is great, the United States is producing so much more oil and becoming so much more energy independent because of shale gas, that we will undermine the incentive to invest in renewable energies, both in the United States and specifically in China, where there's a great incentive for, right now, I think, while the prices of oil are very high, for China to invest in renewable energy to export to the United States. Now, if the U.S. is looking at a future where it's going to become dependent more on shale gas, that becomes less likely, and I think that's problematic for China's current calculation in terms of how it invests in renewable energy. One other small point about the report is that while fracking here and the discoveries of shale gas may in fact reduce coal consumption in the U.S., a lot of that coal is increasingly being exported to China. China has now become, in the last couple of years, a net importer of coal, which means that from a climate change point of view, we're not actually making any progress. The coal is just being burnt elsewhere in China. And then actually, I guess one more thing about the report, again from a climate change point of view, since that's what my center works on primarily, the report itself has, I think, a very sinister prediction in it, which we also need to pay attention to, which also says that it predicts that the long-term average global temperature rise will be 3.6 degrees Celsius. Climate scientists agree that 2 degrees Celsius is pretty much what we can handle. 3.6 is really a death sentence. If you talk to some of the leading climate scientists, that's what they'll say. So I think that's also very problematic, and that we need to be looking at that very seriously. Okay, now I just want to say a couple things about transportation in China. We're looking at how China's energy consumption in general impacts its relationship to the world. I wanted to say a little bit about how China's current consumption of the energy that it does import and the energy that it is using, sort of give you a picture of what that looks like, especially in the transportation sector, which is growing very rapidly in China, and that's because that's my expertise. We've done some work recently on electric vehicles. China has surpassed the United States to become the largest automobile market in the world, and it's now #1 since 2009. And vehicle sales surpassed 18 million units last year and are projected to be close to 25 to 30 million units by 2015. About half of the oil that China imports currently goes to transportation. So this is a pretty big sector, even though transportation in China, looking at all of the different energy consumers, industry, and so on, is actually fairly small. Within the oil consumption, transportation figures very prominently. The electrification of transport has received significant policy and fiscal support from the Chinese central government, yet little attention is being paid to ensuring that low carbon benefits of electrification are actually being realized. One report that we did recently for the United Nations showed that actually in China, in most of the provinces, because the electricity grid is so dependent on coal, that actually driving an electric vehicle has a higher carbon footprint than the equivalent car that has an internal combustion engine. So I know you guys have been talking about electric vehicles, so I thought that would be an interesting thing to bring up, even though it's sort of a grim prediction. And I think that will change as China adopts more diversification of energy, especially from nuclear and hydro. But currently, that's a problem. So we need to make sure that we have both the technology, the electric vehicles, but then also a grid that supports these vehicles in a way that's low carbon. Okay, so that's the first thing. And then I also wanted to say really quickly, another thing we work on is low carbon fuels. What is low carbon when it comes to liquid fuels? We know that since electric vehicles are still still developing phase right now, that we are still really relying on liquid fuels for the next 30 to 50 years, which means we need to have low carbon fuels. But not all carbon fuels, low carbon fuels are created equal, we like to say. And so one of the pieces of work that we have done recently is to create a rating system for the different fuels that are available. We found that second generation bioethanol and biodiesels provide a low carbon alternative, followed by natural gas, and that coal-based fuels are really much more higher carbon. So not all low carbon fuels are equal, and that's important in China's development. And last, I wanted to say one piece about fuel economy standards in China, which is an important piece of China's broader policy on automobile development. China's 2015 automobile fuel consumption target is posing a challenge for many of the current manufacturers of automobiles. Basically, in the next 3 years, manufacturers will have to decrease the average fuel consumption of their vehicles by 8%. So that's about 2.6% annually. Currently, that number has been dropping about 1.3%, and that really indicates that significantly greater efforts are going to be needed by Chinese companies to improve the energy efficiency of the new vehicles that come on the market. So in short, the fuel economy standards are great, but they are going to be challenging for the companies to meet. And I think also one big problem that hovers above all of this is that those fuel economy standards don't apply to all vehicles, specifically the foreign manufactured vehicles. One of the things that we're seeing is that consumers in China tend to want to buy the foreign cars, and so those are the dirtier cars, the higher polluting cars, instead of the cars that are made locally and also more fuel efficient. So that is a problem as well. So I will end there and turn it over, but thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that we'll go back to the very interesting issues that you raised. Honestly, and if I just may add two observations. Firstly, on cars. Personally, I'm surprised how the objectives on fuel efficiency are not ambitious in China. For 2016, the target is much lower than in Europe, for example. So if Europe is able to achieve, China that is just building new equipment in automobiles, in my view, that's the way where they should be more ambitious than they are now. And I think that your observations on the report of the International Energy Agency, I could not agree more with them, because now, market is supply and demand. Supply usually is described now, the big game changer in oil and gas is the US. No, it is not. The #1 source of increase in oil for the next year is not the US and Canada, it's Iraq. It's Iraq. And that is clear in the report of the International Energy Agency. The chapter on the US has 35 pages. I understand that we are in America, New York, so it's natural that more emphasis is given to the US, but the #1 source of increase in supply is Iraq. And demand is China, and it's unprecedented. if things go as is projected, and the assumptions of GDP growth are pretty low. Never in the history of humanity energy demand will increase at such pace. I think this was, your introduction was fantastic, and now I would pass the floor to Professor Wiśnik.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Wiśnik. I'm a senior research scholar here at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute and an associate professor of political science at Montclair State University. I'm going to talk to you today about how China's rising demand for oil affects its foreign relations. And this is part of a broader book project I'm working on that looks at oil, water, and food issues in China and how they affect China's foreign policy and Asian regional security. And so I'm going to start off with some broad statistics just to situate China's oil demand in a global context, and then talk about some of the consequences for foreign policy. First, as you know, China is the second largest consumer of oil after the United States and depends on imported oil for 55% of its consumption. And this surpassed the U.S. For the first time in August of 2011 in terms of how much consumption depends on imports. Estimates claim that by 2030, imports of oil in China could amount to 75% of consumption. And we need to keep this in context that oil is not the leading source of energy in China. That's coal. It accounts for more than 70% of China's energy mix. But oil is number two at 17.7%. So still a very significant source of China's energy. China also produces oil. It's one of the top 5 producers of oil, but it became a net oil importer in 1993. And this is when China's national oil companies began to look overseas for investments in oil. And this is what changed China and turned it into a major player in oil markets. And so why did this happen? The Chinese government implemented a policy that would be called later the going out policy, which encouraged Chinese national oil companies to go out all over the world in search of equity oil investments. So the Chinese government had 2 goals in this policy. One was to reduce dependence on Middle East oil, which constituted 61% of imports in the late 1990s, and also diversify sources of supply. And the second was to ensure the security of supply, because those imports that come from the Middle East, 80% of them went through the Malacca Straits, which caused an issue of vulnerability for Chinese policymakers. And so over the past decade and 10, 15 years, the Chinese government has succeeded in diversifying. So now, if we look at the top sources for oil in China, now only 46% comes from the Middle East, with Saudi Arabia being the leading source. 23% comes from Africa, Angola being the leader there, and now 10% from Russia and Central Asia, and 3% from Asia Pacific. So still almost half of the oil comes from the Middle East, but China has a lot of new energy partners. And nonetheless, this hasn't been a smooth trajectory for China, and China has faced many challenges in its effort to broaden its access to energy supplies. Even in friendly Russia, which is China's strategic partner, China has faced many barriers to upstream investment. In North America, there's been a lot of scrutiny of Chinese investments. China failed to secure the investment in Unocal 2005, and now the Nexen investment in Canada is facing a lot of scrutiny. But China's search for foreign oil has given it much more of a global profile than it used to have. China has expanded its relations with Africa in particular, and also Latin America considerably, Central Asian states, as a result of its energy partnerships. But Chinese companies have been rather late in the game, and so they've had to go to places where the Western majors don't want to go, places like Sudan and Iran. But when they get there, then they have other problems because the Western majors are avoiding these countries for particular reasons, and so then China has foreign policy problems, human rights issues, and other difficulties as a result of these investments. Chinese energy deals also tie it to unstable regions of the world. The China National Petroleum Corporation just made an investment in Afghanistan. It has many investments in Central Asia, and so China is now directly connected to areas where the future is not clear. As a result of these investments, China is also being asked to assume greater global responsibilities. For example, being urged to participate in anti-piracy patrols off the eastern coast of Africa, which is important now for China's energy exports from the region. China has also sought to develop pipeline supplies of oil and gas, connecting it to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan in Central Asia, and to Russia. And this creates greater interdependence with these countries, but at a high cost in terms of the technical aspect. Building these pipelines is not cost-free, and if we look at the reason why did China decide to build such pipelines, I think part of it has to do with this Malacca Straits dilemma, but part of it also has to do with its own regional development, efforts to create a new regional oil and gas center in Xinjiang province in western China that would be anchored into the Central Asian gas projects, create a big infrastructure development area in that province, and also to keep the northeastern Daqing energy complex operating even as oil that's produced there declines. And so I think China's regions have played a big role in urging certain foreign relationships. The financial crisis in 2008 for China was an opportunity in terms of oil relationships, and China developed certain oil for loans agreements with Kazakhstan and Russia that furthered energy relations. Just to conclude, I would say that for China, there's been a problem of perceptions by other countries of its intentions in oil investments that have created new problems. One set of problems I would call security dilemmas, in that they refer to the means that China uses to improve its energy security are seen as reducing the energy security of other countries. And that's because, along with energy investments, China has been developing its naval capacity to help secure its shipping and the sea lanes, securing ports of call for those ships, and making maritime claims, for example, in the South China Sea. And though some of these policies may not be directed against other countries have perceived these policies as being threatening to them, causing new issues in Chinese foreign policy in relations with other countries. And then there is also a tendency to see Chinese investments in oil projects overseas as an effort to lock up supplies and prevent other countries from having access to them, when in fact most of the oil that China produces in these projects is sold on the open market. And if we look at the projects with the highest percentage of equity oil that's sold back to China, that would be Kazakhstan, which has pipeline oil shipped to China. So just to close and find some common ground with what we just heard before, I think China is seeking to reduce its dependence on oil, but it's very difficult because the oil that's imported is largely used in industry and especially in transportation, and it's very hard to find substitutes, particularly for the latter. And the rising middle class does want its foreign luxury cars, and they're not buying hybrid cars. And hybrid cars are a tough sale in China these days, and they're quite expensive. And so I think it's satisfying the demands of the middle class in China contradicts some of the efforts that the Chinese government is trying to make to reduce its demand for imported energy. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I understand that Mr. Ma also wants to add something on energy security.
Hi, my name is Haibin Ma. I'm the head of the China program at the World Watch Institute. We are an environmental think tank based in Washington, D.C., and we founded in 1974. At that time, we are one of the few think tanks that exclusively focusing on sustainable development issues. By that time, our founder, Lester Brown, who wrote quite an influential book called Who Will Feed China? And that was on China's food security issue. I think based on the theme of this panel, I think we may want to write another book called Who Will Power China? Because due to the faster growing speed of China's economy and the relevant energy consumption increase, China has more and more depending on imported energy resources. And many of you may have known that China achieved a lot in terms of development in renewable energy sector. China is now already the world's largest wind market and surpassed the United States in 2011 with installed capacity of about 63 gigawatts. And China is expected to reach 100 gigawatts by 2015. But China's renewable energy development also encountered a lot of problems. And one of the major problems is the lack of infrastructure development. You may have also known that some reports say that at least 1/3 of those installed wind capacity was not connected to the grid because of the reason not much advanced smart grid technology to accommodate those wind generation capacity, and the transmission grid is also limited. And in terms of solar development, China is, of course, the largest solar panel producers in the world, but China's leadership is really only in the manufacturing front. In terms of technology, China was not that advanced. And sitting on our panel, we have the former president of the SunPower, one of the leading solar companies in the United States. And according to him, he said that China's solar technology is really like the modest. And although they are trying to develop the most advanced state-of-the-art technology as soon as possible, but with other, short-sighted investment plans, that has been hampered at the current stage. And due to the worldwide economic recession in the past 2 to 3 years, China's export of solar equipment to EU market has dramatically reduced, which caused the Chinese government to make a decision to significantly ramp the domestic solar market. Right now, the domestic solar power generation installed capacity is about only 3 gigawatts. And the Chinese government made a plan to ramp that into 15 gigawatts by 2015. Considering there's only about 3 years to go, that's a really ambitious plan. And one of the solutions Chinese government made is to significantly develop this kind of distributed solar power generation. And instead of those large-scale solar farms, which still relies on grid infrastructure, the government decided to put a emphasis on this distributed one, which can will be mainly supporting industrial parks, huge office buildings, and some large-scale residential community. Because it has less reliance on the grid infrastructure, it may have more opportunity to be successful. But in terms of the renewable energy as a whole, it is still only occupies a very small share of the China's total energy mix. If I remember it correctly, the share of renewable energy in China's primary energy supply is less than 3% by the end of 2011. And China has a goal to have at least 15% of non-fossil fuel energy supply by 2020. And the goal for 2015 is 11.4%. And now China's non-fossil fuel energy resource, the share of the total primary energy supply is about 8.9. But remember that that is non-fossil fuel. It doesn't equal to renewable energy because it's also included nuclear energy. Even though that China achieved those goals, the contribution from renewable sources is still relatively small compared to the entire energy pictures. And since our colleague Professor Elizabeth already covered the oil part, I would also I would like to focus on the other major energy source of China's energy supply, and of course the biggest one is the coal. The coal represent about 70% of China's total primary energy supply at this stage, and represent about 65% of China's total electricity generation. But in 2000, China used to be self-sufficient on coal supply, but in 2009, China becomes a net importer of the coal. Although there are some domestic reasons that contributed to this turn because of this pricing system and the significant increase of domestic transportation cost and all those coal industry reform in China contributed to this change. But given the increasing speed of China's coal consumption, it's possible that China will the gap between domestic supply and total consumption will still be enlarged in the future, and China will become a solid coal importer in the future. And domestically, China has a technically proved reserve of coal about 135 billion tons, and China's coal consumption last year is about 3.8 billion tons. And even China, will keep the same coal consumption at that level. China's coal, the domestic coal reserve, only cannot sustain China for more than 50 years, probably only about 30 years. So China will more and more rely on coal importance. And in terms of global impact, I don't think China's coal import will have the same influence as the oil US, because resourcing the origin countries from China's coal importance now is mainly from Australia and Indonesia. It's not much, politically or economically or militarily sensitive countries. It's mainly about it's all about the business. I don't think it has much more global impact than the oil import has. And let's talk to you about the second largest electricity generation source, the hydropower. Now, China's hydropower contributes about 22% of its total energy, its total electricity generation, and about I think 7% of its total primary energy supply. And China has made also an ambitious plan to significantly boost the hydropower sector. And the planning development region is mainly focusing on the southwestern regions. And the government has already made a plan to build at least 10 large-scale hydropower bases, with each of them has an installed capacity of equal or larger than 10 gigawatts. And you may have seen from the reports that that kind of plan already triggers some international issues, especially with southeastern countries, because many of the rivers in the southeastern countries like Vietnam and Thailand, and they're also originated from the Tibet area and the Sichuan area in China. And if China builds of those dozens of dams in the upstream of the river and the downstream of the southeastern country will significantly suffer, not just about the energy sector, also about the livings, because many of the farmers and the other peasants and also fishermen, their lives are depending on those rivers. And if the dam were especially on upstream and with such a scale, it will be significantly reduce the downstream flows, and those downstream countries will suffer. So you also see that there's a lot of political debates going on between these plans, but I don't think that the Chinese government is retreating right now from those original plans. So on this ground, it's really a tricky issue, and we should keep our eyes on that. And the last but not the least important is the nuclear sector. And China now has an installed capacity, not an installed capacity, it's an operational capacity about 12 gigawatts of nuclear power generation capacity right now. But China wants to ramp that into 70 gigawatts by the end of 2020. And in terms of the nuclear, the generation source, the uranium resource, only the Chinese domestic minings can only supply less than 25% of the uranium sources. So about 3/4 of those resources have to be imported from other countries. Right now, the main resource of those reunions came from Kazakhstan, Namibia, Niger, and recently from Australia. And the Chinese government is also desperately to try to secure new deals with other countries, including Uzbekistan and other countries in Latin America. And this again, I don't see it has many environmental related impacts globally, but it may change the political structure globally, because as China became more and more dependent on those resources, and will have to enhance its relationship with those resourcing countries, and this may trigger some global political issues. And I'll stop there and with questions later.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting, everything you mentioned. And something I kept in mind is that now the emergence of China has strengthened the linkages in the energy area. You mentioned, for example, Australia, Indonesia. I was in Australia over the summer, and two things that I kept in mind was, firstly, the two parties in Australia. It was a competition who would be more friendly towards Chinese FDI. In the past, they were cautious. But now it became so important that it was a kind of competition, and acquisitions, for example, in companies like BHP and Rio Tinto were really strategic in Australia. And on top of that, I listened to a speech by, I would say, the #1 policymaker in Australia. I would not mention his name, where was saying the following: the secret of the success of Australia is luck. Luck. Australia is in the right place in the right moment, and the explanation is China. So now the next stage will be energy demand in China, please. Okay, Mr. Hao.
Thanks very much, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to join you here today. I want to do a couple things. I want to try to be provocative to get you through the afternoon slump and get you all warmed up for David Sandalo, because he's going to be great at 4:30, and I don't want you sleeping through his remarks. And I'm going to try to be brief so we can get to the Q&A, because I know we're at like 4 o'clock, and I'm sure you folks have questions. We were joking before about how, if you had at a session like this an America panel, it would be impossibly broad. There would be a huge range of topics to cover. And likewise, if you have a China panel, as you can see, there's China and the energy sector in China is a vast topic, and there's a lot to talk about. What I'm going to do with my time is take us up a little bit, 30,000-foot view on how the past decade it was different than what I think the next decade is going to be in terms of energy demand and the relationship between demand and the economy, and what that means for the rest of the world. And I'm going to try to do that in like 5 minutes, so let's see how that goes. A little bit of background. I work for an economic research firm here in the city called the Rhodium Group. We do research on disruptive global trends, of which China's rise is one of them. We spend a fair amount of time on that. Have done a couple of stints in government over the past years. One where I had the great pleasure of doing all the jobs at the U.S. Embassy that nobody else wanted to do, like go down coal mines in Inner Mongolia and traipse around oil and gas fields in Shandong province. And then more recently, in 2009, worked for the State Department as a senior advisor on bilateral U.S.-China energy issues and on the Copenhagen talks, which was a similarly thankless task. So I'm happy to be back in the private sector and back here in New York. If we look at kind of the past, let's call it 30 years of Chinese history, between 1980 and 2000, the Chinese economy was growing very fast, 9–10% a year. Energy demand was only growing half that rate. And so resources were not a constraint on Chinese economic growth. And if you were in the energy markets, you didn't really pay any attention to China, in part because the country had a lot of domestic resources, was a net oil exporter until 1993, but because energy demand was just growing slowly. Then 2000 to 2010, the economy continued to grow at 9–10%, but the relationship between economic growth and energy demand fundamentally changed. So instead of growing at half the rate of the economy, energy demand grew faster than economic growth. And it was that change in the relationship between economic growth and energy demand that is the reason why we're having a China panel today. Not because China is growing fast, but because China started growing in a very energy-intensive manner. So when you look at, for example, the IEA's forecasts of Chinese energy demand in 2002, and then their revisions in 2010, they upward revised their 2030 estimates for Chinese energy demand by like 79–80% over an 8-year period. That's 2 Indias of today or an India of 2030. That's our kind of margin of error, those of us in the analytical community, when we think about Chinese energy future. So that should give us all a little bit of humility before opining about what China's going to look like 10 years, 20 years down the road. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to opine on what China will be like 10 years, 20 years down the road. Over the past year or so that growth, that increase in the energy and commodities intensity of the Chinese economy touched off the 3rd commodities supercycle over the past 150 years, right? We had a supercycle, for those of you who don't deal in commodities markets, is a sustained bull run in commodities prices, kind of 10 to 30 years in length, due to a structural increase in commodities demand that takes a while for supply to catch up. Right? So we had a commodity supercycle in the early 1900s, thanks to the U.S. Industrial Revolution. We had another one during post-war Reconstruction, and we've been in the midst of another supercycle for the past decade, thanks largely to China and the knock-on effects of China's economic growth. Because as Chinese demand for iron ore or for oil pushed up global prices, the countries that produced and sold those goods benefited from faster economic growth. Australia's fortuitous position, Brazil, the Middle East, and so those countries saw significant increases in commodities demand as well. I think the supercycle is over. That over the next decade, not only will Chinese economic growth slow, but the energy intensity and commodities intensity of Chinese economic growth is going to significantly decline, and Australia is going to see its luck run out pretty shortly. Earlier this year, folks in Wall Street who kind of comb through economic data trying to find ways to put short trades on the Chinese economy started paying attention to the power demand data, right? And while the National Bureau of Statistics was saying, yeah, the economy's slowing, but we're going from like 9% to 7.5%, consistent with the soft landing. This isn't the apocalypse, not hard landing. The power demand data was saying something very different. Power demand for the past decade has grown faster than economic growth in China. It's grown like 12–15% a year. This year, power demand's growing at like 2% a year. And then you see things like comments by Li Keqiang and some WikiLeaks cables saying that I don't pay attention to GDP data, that's all makey-uppy. I look at three things: money supply, rail freight, and power demand. And everybody starts freaking out, right? That the Chinese economy is collapsing and that the official GDP data is a lie. There's a way to reconcile those two trends, the difference between what's happening in commodities demand in China right now and what's happening in GDP. And that's a fundamental change in the structure of the economy, unwinding the investment surge in infrastructure that we've seen over the past decade that gave rise to Chinese energy demand. When you land in Beijing, you see shiny new apartment buildings and streets clogged with automobiles, and most people conclude that that is the source of Chinese energy demand today. That's China's future energy challenge, but today 75% of energy demand comes from industry. 50% comes from just 5 industries, from iron and steel, non-ferrous metals, non-metallic mineral products, chemicals, paper, and pulp. That drives Chinese energy demand today. Those sectors, the basic materials sector, is staple to infrastructure investment and property investment. And over the past decade, moving 200 million Chinese from the countryside to the city, or building up cities in what used to be countryside, has created a lot of demand for those goods and a lot of energy demand. Infrastructure and real estate investment has fallen off a cliff over the past year, in part by policy design, and is never going to return to the rates that we've seen over the past decade. And that means a fundamental change in the commodities intensity of Chinese growth at the very same time as overall Chinese economic growth is starting to decline, because China's reaching that point of its economic development where growth declines. And macroeconomists have a debate about, I'm from Wyoming, so I speak in ski metaphors, of whether China's going to go down the bunny slope or take the double black diamond route down the mountain. For those of you who are not skiers, the bunny slope means they take the kind of Japan, Korea, Taiwan path, which is, 9% to 8% to 7% to 6%. Nice gradual deceleration of growth, right? A double black diamond would be the Mexico path, straight down the middle income trap into like 2% or negative growth. And this keeps policymakers in Beijing up at nights terrified about whether or not they're going to be able to break through the middle income trap. But there is no debate about the fact that overall economic growth is going to slow. One of the things that will determine whether China takes the bunny slope or the double black diamond path down is whether they're successful in solidifying this change in the structure of growth, rebalancing the economy. You hear macroeconomists talk about this, from investment and exports, the really energy intensive stuff, to domestic consumption and services, which is not very energy intensive. So what's good news for the Chinese economy is actually, ironically, very bad news for global commodities markets. If Chinese economy continues to grow strongly over the next decade, the commodities intensity of that growth is going to be very low. It's going to be back down to 0.5 or less. At the same time that supply has finally caught up to Chinese demand, right? In oil, we see it here in the North American unconventional oil and gas boom, that a decade of high prices got a supply response, as you would imagine that it would. If oil's $100 a barrel, people are going to find out ways to produce more oil. And you see that in iron ore and in copper and across the board, investment in supply that over the next 10 years will be outpacing the growth in demand, which will take us on the backside of the commodities cycle. Last kind of insane prediction I'll make, I think Chinese CO2 emissions this year will be flat. I think Chinese emissions will not grow this year. Maybe they'll grow 2%, right? Which will be pretty surprising to people after 10, 11% annual growth in CO2 emissions. So there's a clear environmental benefit from this rebalancing as well. So with that, it's kind of food for thought for the Q&A. I'll end there.
Thank you very much. Now I would suggest that we enter Q&A, the Q&A part of the session, please.
Thank you, panelists, for coming. I really appreciate this talk. My name is David Abrahamson. I'm a second-year student at the School of International and Public Affairs. I have a question for Trevor and Haiping, and any of you can chime in if you have any thoughts on this. But in September, China started its emissions trading schemes in Hunan, and in 2013, they're going to roll out other regional emission systems in the rest of the country. Now, in August, Australia and the EU announced that they're planning on connecting their emissions trading systems and might have an international trading system. What do you think is the potential for an international trading system with China as a participant, or is this just a fantasy at this point?
Do you want to go first, or you want me to take it?
Yeah, interesting. I just came back from a business trip in China, and I was specifically focusing on these emission trading things. And first, a small correction. And now, China only have a pilot emission trading schemes focusing on 5 cities and 2 provinces. And you may have heard the report, especially in the Western media, that China has 2 goals about this emission trading system. Is by at the end of next year, 2013, they will have fully operational regional trading markets in those 7 regions. And by the end of 2015, they will have a national carbon market. But according to my kind of discussion with both central government officials and officials from those regions, the second goal is not realistic. They probably were going to significantly postpone the national market, the mature period. But for the first goal, they're going to do that. But it's been on how robust their trading plan is still too early to say at this stage. I was in discussion with this professor at Wuhan University, which is the capital city of Hubei province, which is one of the 2 provinces that conduct this pilot emission trading. And our discussion was exactly the day before he reported the Hubei provincial emission trading plan to the central government. And I took a glimpse of their plans, and comparing to the international standards of emission trading plan and concrete implementation plan, that provincial plan still have a lot of holes in there, and will took them a lot of effort to try to negotiate and convince the provincial industries and the enterprise to take part in that plan. And yeah, it's important to think in advance that how to connect and bridge those regional trading plans, and to form this national market, and even beyond that to bridging with other international carbon market things. I think there's already a lot of scholars and officials in China are focusing on that, but all their thoughts and the plannings and the research plans are still in the very early stage, and I don't see any concrete plan yet. So we have to wait and see. Maybe by the end of next year we'll have a better idea about that.
Yeah, I agree with that. The only thing I'd add is, so there's a difference between linked programs and offset programs, right? So I think that you will certainly see, like the CDM, bilateral offset programs, particularly from Japan, as they try to meet fairly ambitious targets with 0 domestic abatement opportunities, and do that by paying Japanese companies to invest in offset projects in China. And I think likewise you could see bilateral offset programs with Australia. Over the long term, I think it's perfectly reasonable that there would be linked carbon trading programs. And I think there's 2 types of pilots in China. There's like showcase pilots that aren't serious, and there's real pilots. And I think this is a real pilot. The institutional challenges are huge in setting up the infrastructure required for the type of cap and trade system that would be robust enough for a OECD compliance regime like in Australia or Japan to trust a linked program, right? I mean, when we were talking about Waxman-Markey here in the States, there were a lot of elements of that the Europeans thought would make it impossible to have linked ETSs between the 2 systems. So then when you think about syncing up, an Australian ETS with a Chinese ETS, the problems are even larger. So I think it's moving in the right direction. I think it's a long game. It's going to take a decade at least to get to the point where we have a legally robust national emissions trading scheme in China.
Mm-hmm. Just add one point that at this stage, we have already seen the European countries and other countries who have carbon markets in planning, like South Korea and New Zealand. They are sending delegations and representatives to China, to those pilot regions, and try to influence their plans. By doing this in the early stage, hopefully, they can make those pilot regions more sophisticated, like close to the stage, like this matured market, like EU ETS is. So in the future, just clear the way for future integration and bridging. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much.
Please.
I just want to add one quick thing, because my organization has worked significantly on this. I think that I agree with my colleagues that it is a long way off, but I do think that these pilots are serious. But there is still one problem that remains that's been difficult to get over, which is that China is still measuring carbon emissions in terms of energy intensity per unit of economic output, not in terms of absolute terms. So I think that makes the interplay between the other countries and China difficult, because you just have, again, it's this apples to orange comparison, and that's the thing that we've been working on, is how to create measuring, reporting, and verification, MRV. This is something, a buzzword that people talk about a lot in China, in a way so that different regions, different countries can communicate with each other in terms of carbon. But I do think that there are more voluntary carbon markets that are emerging, so markets that are not run by the governments, and different reporting programs where companies can voluntarily report their emissions profiles and come up with data that could eventually be used in emissions trading programs. And I think that there has been some progress on that.
Great, thank you very much.
If you don't mind, I would just like to add something. Climate change is a rather depressing topic of discussion, given the lack of progress in international climate negotiations. However, I have high expectations on China, and it's not because of climate change. It's because of pollution. Now, those who never went to Beijing, you cannot imagine the level of pollution twice a week. I mean, it's dark. You cannot breathe. And so now I think that it's a matter of survival for the Chinese government and for the Chinese. The targets on the 12th five-year plan, they are ambitious. Of course, they are not in absolute terms. So it can be discussed, what does it mean? Because it's a matter of identity. It will be, what will be GDP growth will be, by the end of the day, CO2 emissions. But I think that this is not this will not be the discussion in China. It's a matter of survival for the country and for the political regime. Pollution, not only in Beijing, in the other cities. Those who went to visit Hong Kong 10 years ago, now Hong Kong has nothing to do with 10 years ago. I mean, it became ugly, polluted, and that is a survival problem. So with that regard, I think that the incentive is there, and I would say if the Chinese government does not act very promptly on CO2 emissions, they will have big problems, not because of climate change, but because of lack of quality of life. I don't know if you agree with this.
Yeah, I think the overall China's motivation to pursue this kind of low carbon economy is it's double-edged. On the one hand, this severe pollution issue, environmental degradation, but on the other hand, Chinese government specifically sees this low carbon economy and those green technology as a rare opportunity, another growth opportunity for them. That's why they're invested so heavily on those clean energy and those 7 emerging new sector things, and 3 of them are energy related. At WorldWatch, we always argue that it's good you have a goal that could get you toward this sustainability, but the path and approach you chosen to approaching those goals need to be sustainable as well. And judging from the recent development, especially on the solar manufacturing sector, you can see that's not what the Chinese government is doing. There's heavy, excessive investment and with less management, which cause a lot of, still cause a lot of environmental pollution things. So even if you are, producing these clean products like solar panel, but if you, during the process, if you are causing other greater, environmental pollution, I don't think that's a sustainable way. So we think that always, also in our reports and other products, we always focus on this, argument and try to, advise the Chinese government to be concerned of that.
Let's take another question, okay?
Can I add just one point to this? it's not just a matter of survival, it's an issue of political survival now too, because the Chinese government is trying to make promotion incentives within regions based on meeting specific environmental targets as a way of encouraging attention to these things. Because they tried before with green GDP concept, which went nowhere, and so now they're trying to tie political advancement to these targets. But you would think, I mean, I've been to Beijing too, to know how polluted it is. Many in the middle class are very upset about this pollution, but the people who are most adversely affected by environmental conditions are in rural areas, and these people don't have political clout. And so it's a paradox that there is such a severe problem which eats away at China's growth, but there so far has been a lack of political will to really tackle it.
And I think the political future also have some international aspects as well, because you may think that China's only opponent in international climate negotiations is the United States, but in the recent years, China is facing a growing disagreement and pressure from its developing country colleagues, especially from those less developed countries and small island countries. And those countries sees China as not anymore in the stage of a developing country, considering China's world's second largest economy, and it's really pushing China to do more. And this emission trading things, China is doing that. They are doing seriously. I think they're partially as an answer to those requests from those least developed countries and small island countries.
Thank you very much. Please.
Hi, my name is Svetlana, and I'm visiting from NYU. Thank you for a great discussion. I was just wondering if you can speak to the Nexen deal that is under the consideration of the Canadian federal government. It's a $15 billion deal of a Chinese state-owned company to acquire a Canadian company, and that may change the future of the Canadian market and the energy security of North America. Do you think this will happen? Will it go through? And what will the impact be on North American energy security?
So we are a party to that transaction, so I can't speak to the likely outcome of that deal. I can give my point of view on how it would impact North American energy security as long as it's not for attribution. I don't know if we have press in the, yeah? No? Okay. This is just my view. It's not the view of the parties to the transaction. So Nexen is a Canadian headquartered oil and gas company. It produces a little north of 180,000 barrels a day of oil. Most of that's in the North Sea in the UK. It has assets in offshore Nigeria and some old assets in Yemen. It has an oil sands operation and a shale gas operation in Canada, and it has a number of leases in the Gulf of Mexico. The U.S. production of Nexen, oil and gas combined, is about 18,000 barrels a day. So that's 0.1% of U.S. output. Nexen's share of North American output is slightly higher than that, but still less than 1%. For the U.S., if we're thinking about energy security in kind of very crude terms, pun intended, would a Chinese company's investment in the U.S. reduce supply? Is CNOOC coming to North America to take oil back to China? In the case of the U.S., because of some old legislation we have, CNOOC would have to go knock on the door of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and ask permission to export crude oil from the U.S. because we don't allow crude oil exports except to NAFTA countries without government permission. So the combination of the kind of quantity and the relative to the size of the U.S. market and the legal environment, to me suggests there's not a lot to be concerned about in terms of energy security. Oil is also a fungible market, so even if CNOOC took the 0.1% of U.S. production that Nexen is responsible for back to China, that would free up 18,000 barrels a day of oil somewhere else in the world that China wouldn't be buying, that would be available on the global market because it's a fungible market. More importantly, Nexen is a very small company in a very big boys game in the Gulf of Mexico. They are probably the smallest operator in the Gulf of Mexico. These projects are multi-billion-dollar, extremely capital-intensive, complex projects. You need a very strong balance sheet to make these projects real. Some of Nexen's partners, larger oil companies that they're JV'd with in the Gulf of Mexico, were very excited to learn about the acquisition because they had concerns about Nexen's ability to keep up. So on balance, I think the application of CNOOC capital to Gulf of Mexico assets is going to increase the amount of oil the Gulf of Mexico produces, because you have Nexen leases that would have had a harder time getting brought to operation given Nexen's balance sheet. So in my read, net, and obviously I'm biased on this, so take that fully into account. I think that it is a net positive for U.S. energy security. It means better supply, and there's not really any way to take that oil back to China. And even if they did, it wouldn't really matter.
Thank you.
And I understand that there is a larger transaction at the pipeline.
Sorry?
I understand that there is a larger transaction at the pipeline by CNOOC. Yeah. But if I may give my view, I think it takes the wildest imagination to figure out that Chinese state-owned companies have an imperialist view of oil. As Professor mentioned, China will be by miles the largest oil importer in the world, and now they are on a defensive mood, trying to buy assets. If it's not in Canada, from the point of view of the Chinese, no problem. They will buy in Iraq. They are buying a lot in Iraq, in Sudan, in Angola, in Nigeria, and this is capitalism at work. If Canada and the U.S. don't want it, they will go to Brazil. Brazil will want it. Canada, Nigeria, Sudan, Iraq. So this is something that cannot be stopped.
Yeah, that actually raises an important. This is to the broader U.S. national security implications of a deal like this. So we are very concerned about Chinese investments in places like Iran, right? And we have some powerful sticks to try to deter companies from investing in Iran, called extraterritorial financial sanctions. The U.S. Treasury Department can severely limit your company's ability to do business in the U.S. or do business in dollars if you cross a sanctions red line. That gives us leverage over companies who have business in the U.S., right? If Chinese oil companies have no assets in the U.S. and no economic interest in the U.S., we have no leverage, right? If Chinese oil companies have a $15 billion asset in North America, then they become much more risk-averse in terms of thinking about the implications of sanctions. And you see this already in the behavior of Chinese oil companies vis-a-vis Iran, who have all started to slow walk their investment there because of the risk of sanctions and because of the excitement about the North American unconventional oil and gas boom. You know, if you're looking at Ed Morse's talk from lunch, and you're looking at the multi-billion dollars of annual M&A activity and greenfield investment that's happening in North America, and you might get excluded from that by doing a JV with NIOC in Iran that's maybe going to produce and maybe not going to produce, right? That's a risk calculation that you want to take pretty seriously. And so I think that there are some national security upsides to having those assets in the U.S., which is a good point that you raised.
Mr. Pino, just to let you know, we are wrapping up with Q&A, and we should wrap up our session as best you wish at this point.
So is there a chance for one question?
No, I think we have to wrap by 4:30, just so you know, sir. I know, but it has to be, it has to be extremely quick just to stay on schedule, just to let you know.
That's fine. Yeah, just a really quick question. My name is Wei Wei. I'm from SIPA, second-year student. My question is about the increasing China energy demand and the U.S. military strategy. Because based on my reading, now U.S. military 1/4 of the budget is directly or indirectly related to secure the crude oil supply. So by 2025 or 2030, when the U.S. get sort of energy independence or North American energy independence, I suppose U.S. military Navy's strategy will decrease the budget in the Middle East sea line. crude oil transportation, which means to get the crude oil from Strait Hormuz and go to the North America. So back then, so goes to that age, how is the change of U.S. military Navy strategy, and will the rest of the world can trust China or India to secure the Middle East sea land transportation?
This is a long question.
I can hopefully make the organizers happy by having a very short answer, which is, I think that's a great question. In fact, I'm writing my dissertation on that right now, because I think that's the most important question, how the Navy is dealing with energy in securing shipping lanes. But I think the answer is that we don't know. I mean, I think this is a big change, and we'll just have to wait and see. I think that is the question that we should be, in my view, looking at going forward. So sorry to not be able to answer, but I agree. That's the question that I would be asking as well. So thank you.
It's a great question to make the first question to David Sandalo after his talk, I think.
So I would like to thank our panelists. You were really brilliant. The questions were very, very interesting. And I would leave here the suggestion that next year we'll do another panel about China, because there is a huge interest. There are a lot of things that remain to be answered. And again, congratulations to the organizers. Thank you.